We are in the last chapter of Megillat Esther. It is 3 psukim long, and I have a feeling we'll be able to finish it today. But there's a lot of handouts that I've sent ahead and that I also have here in person for people who want it. Where we left off last week, and just to pick up with the last pasuk of Perek Tet, Uma'amar Esther Kiyam, Divrei HaPurim ha'ele v'nichtam b'sefer. That we said that what Esther had tried to effectuate, the word or the command of Esther, which really, as we know, wasn't an absolute command because it needed the agreement of the Chachmei Eretz Yisrael, of the sages of Eretz Yisrael, the nascent Anshe Knesset HaGdolah to go along with them. They were fulfilled as she had asked them to do, and each of the steps, v'nichtab b'sefer, and then it was written in the book. Now, nichtab b'sefer is that ultimately it was written, this ma'amar, was this whole request, and all of what we had before was included within the book itself. Now, is the book itself, nichtab b'sefer, it could possibly mean that this is the statement that it was included in the canon of the Tanakh itself. That you have the book of Esther, it was the original, if you remember, originally was written, everything was written as a letter, and it was sent, there was correspondence that went back and forth. Here is the report. It was a nice thick report, but it was still considered an Iggeret, and that's the way it's referred to throughout. And it could very well be, as Rashi notes at the end of this pasuk, not only was Purim accepted as a holiday, but Megillat Esther was accepted as one of the 24 books of the Tanakh. Now, the Ibn Ezra disagrees with Rashi in that piece. Rashi said that ultimately that what she wrote is not really what we have as Megillat Esther. We're missing some of the correspondence, which wasn't considered significant enough to be able to retain as part of Megillat Esther, but it was written in those correspondences that happened between them. So we're now at the point we were coming to sum everything up. The story is over, right? We started with the story of the feast. We then went to Vashti, then we went to Bigtan B'Teresh, then we went to the ascension of Haman, then we went to the selection of Esther, then we went to the pieces of Mordechai and Esther trying to foil the plot of Haman. The plot was foiled. The Jews defended themselves. They declared the various festivities of Purim on the 2 different days because of the type of victories that existed within the war itself. All of those things happened, and all of those things were now finished. So we come up with 3 psukim, and I'm going to do these 3 psukim a little differently than I normally do, because since the whole entire parak is only 3 psukim, let's just read the 3 psukim first, and then we'll go back and see it. Because there's some interesting issues you see when you look at the totality of this culminating parak. Vayasam hamelech Achashverosh mas ala aretz v'yeyayam. Achashverosh placed a tax over the land, we assume over the land that he controlled, the 127 provinces, and also over those landmasses, there were islands. V'chol ma'aseh tokfo gvurato, and all of his power and his valor, uvarashat gdulat Mordechai, and also the issue of the greatness of Mordechai, asher gidlo hamelech, that the king had lifted up, haloim tuvim al sefer divrei yamim lemalchei paras umadai uparas. They are, after all, written in the chronicles of the kings of Media and Persia. Ki Mordechai HaYehudi, that Mordechai HaYehudi, Mordechai the Jew, Mishneh Melech Achashverosh, was the second in command to Achashverosh, V'gadol LaYehudim, and he was great to the Jewish people, V'ratzui L'rov Echav, and he was wanted by Rov Echav. Rov Echav can be translated as the majority of his people. It's a source of a lot of wonderful drashot, but it also can mean by all of his people. Doresh Tov Lamo, he was seeking peace for his people, v'dover shalom l'chol zaro, and he spoke, seeking good for his people, v'dover shalom l'chol zaro, and he sought peace for all of his offspring, all of his seed. Now, in this piece, which we have here, is a culminating story of Achashverosh, and not so much Mordechai, if you think about it just for a moment. Because if you look at the text is more is Achashverosh centric. It talks about Achashverosh's taxes. It talks about the greatness of Achashverosh. It talks about Achashverosh having lifted up Mordechai, and then it talks about all of this being chronicled, and then only at the end do we kind of have Mordechai, and that word which introduces it, Ki Mordechai, could be because, or that, or since. There's 5 different definitions of the word ki, but all of this could be in the place that Achashverosh, and look what he did for Mordechai, which is a very different tone. And part of the question which we have to look at when we look at these 3 psukim is, why is there this difference in tone? What's the purpose behind this entire piece? That's the introduction. So let's start with some of the details, and hopefully in the course of this conversation, we'll have the answer to all of those questions. The first thing that we learn about is it says, Vayasam HaMelech Achashverosh mas ala haaretz v'aliyei hayam. He places a tax. Now, what's the significance? Why should we care if he placed a tax or not? Okay, now it's true there are some people who are tax attorneys and they would like to care about taxes. But what does it say about the government that puts the tax down? So the first thing is, when we look at taxation, taxation shows power of government. And so in essence, when we say that he placed a tax over all of the people, it could very simply be that this is trying to show his power. And in fact, one of the handouts that I sent and also that I gave out was just a quote from Professor Yonatan Grossman. Now, Yonatan Grossman, again, is a professor. He also is an alum of, he also teaches at Herzog. I believe he's an alum of also of Yeshivat Har Etzion. And on this page, which is just, it looks just like it's typed because that's what it really was, he talks about the fact of what is this reasoning behind this. And so he writes, I have the impression that through this link, the narrator expresses his disdain for Mordechai's greatness, which was bestowed on him by the king. Both the power and victimhood of the Jews depended on the king's whim and could change in an instant. Indeed, the narrative emphasized this point. A further comparison highlights the allusion to the king's fickleness in these verses. If you look at it, all of these psukim, in other words, that Achashverosh is so powerful, could be a way of saying that, we think we're on the top of the world, but we're totally up to the whim and the fancy of the king. After all this happens, the king makes sure we all know how powerful he is, and therefore he exerts his power. It's a fascinating way of looking at this, of his power over everything, and it's not the only one, because another one of the sheets that I handed out to you is actually from the Jewish Quarterly Review. I had sent this to everyone as well, and I refer you to page 140 in the Jewish Quarterly Review. I will pull this up. I'm sorry, I hadn't pulled up the other ones first. Yes? Yeah.
And who was the narrator according to Grossman?
Grossman is the narrator of the Megillah. Who's the author of the Megillah?
Did we just say a few psukim ago was the narrator of this?
Well, if you look at it, it says Vayasam HaMelech. Now it's a third person. It's not Esther talking. It seems to be a narration piece right now that's a little complicated.
It wouldn't be this Megillah that was included in the canon by
The Megillah, but who wrote these words of this last parak? Okay, what is the writing? Now we accept that it means it's Mordechai and Esther, but even when you're an author, you can take on the voice of something else. Is this talking? Is Mordechai talking here? Is Esther talking here? Or does it seem to be as if they're writing with a narrator, with someone in the background, just observing from beyond? And that's what he means by the narrator. Okay. He isn't, by the way, Yonatan Grossman is a frum person. He isn't rejecting anything of Chazal here. He just says, what do they want in this? What's the purpose here? And that's what he means by narrator. Now, and I don't know how to pronounce his name, Daub or Daubi, I'm really not sure how to pronounce it. We are now looking at the Jewish Quarterly Review. And he has an interesting article. I sent the full article in the email last night if you want to read the full article, but just have a couple of pieces that are highlighted. He writes, I wish to submit that the last chapter of Esther forms a conclusion worthy of the whole. And that among some of the final remarks upon the happy state of Jewry under Mordechai's regime, it embodies in 10:1, in this first pasuk, one of the great political arguments of the author, namely that a government is more to gain by orderly taxation than by giving over the Jews to massacre and indiscriminate plunder. And it continues on the other side on page 141. To begin with, we are told in 3:9 that Haman promised the king a large sum of money if he was permitted to destroy the Jews. That the sum was meant to come from the victims, there can be little doubt, and many authorities, strain among them, inclined to this view. In the despotic East, prescription of a man always involved confiscation of his possessions by the crown. So did capital punishment, as we see from Esther itself. In other words, what he's talking about in this source, and I'm obviously not going through the whole thing, because I have a feeling with these 3 psukim, we may run out of time, and Purim is this week. I want to make sure we finish it. What Darby really says here is a fascinating piece. And that is that why is there a tax coming up now? Because if you remember, Haman's whole appeal was a monetary appeal. There's these people, they're disconnected, they're really nothing. But if I go ahead and I take care of those people, whatever taking care of those people means, if I take care of them, you're going to become rich. And so what the last thing that happens is that everything's set, all the dust is settled, and Mordechai puts into place, through his advice to Achashverosh, Mordechai isn't mentioned as being the source of the taxation, but according to Darby, Achashverosh puts into place, and look, he's now able to make even more money than he would have had he killed the Jews. Yeah.
Okay, sorry for being the problem finder, but in chapter 3,
Pasuk
verse
Chet.
11,
And also going back to Chet, yeah, he had placed go ahead, yeah.
he said, "Vayomer Melech LaHaman hakesef nasun lach, hakesef natun lach."
Mhm.
The money's yours. I don't need it.
Right.
So he was rejecting the
So,
benefit
at-
of the.
He was rejecting it in the end, but if you remember, this whole appeal was an appeal of people who you don't need, and there's a benefit to them, whether he was going to take it for himself or not, just as he doesn't take Haman's house and Haman's possession, but he passes it over to Achashverosh. But that's the right of the king to make that decision. According to Dalby, what he's saying is, look, and again, that Grossman criticizes Dalby for that reason as well. According to Dalby, he says, wait a second, but why we care about Achashverosh having this tax? Grossman says, because it shows his power. That we're seeing that basically, we're in this really good mood. We think everything is turned. And the narrator of the Megillah says, whoa, it's not so simple. The Jews are not, right now we're on top of the world, but it doesn't mean we're eternally safe. We exist at the whim of this ruler who can tomorrow just go ahead and change the taxes and impose taxes. And by the way, what kind of taxes could they be? We'll talk about that in a minute. He can go ahead and do what he wants to do. Yeah.
Isn't it an allusion to Hashem by saying the king has the absolute power?
Well, what we say that God has the absolute power, but here it's no question. It's talking about Achashverosh. No allusion because it says Vayasam Hamelech Achashverosh. It says clearly it's Achashverosh. When the Medrash talks about the times, where is God in the Megillah? It talks about when God isn't mentioned, but the king could be the king of kings. Here, when it says King Achashverosh, we know clearly who it is. Yeah.
So this was right, pretty much almost before they're gonna build the second Beit HaMikdash, right?
Maybe.
Right? Okay, maybe, because I was.
Okay, so it's again, to get you all a little complicated. Okay, remember, we have all of these years that we don't know what happened. So first of all, according to historians, there is a disagreement. This could be in the period, it's after Cyrus, that everyone agrees. Cyrus initiates the first call, Ezra and Nehemiah go back there to Israel. It could be in the middle of the building of the Beit HaMikdash, between those 70 years. It could be after those 70 years, depending what we do with the missing 200 plus years.
Because I was just gonna say, this could be sort of a hint to everyone, you think you're all doing great here, everything's great, but you know what? Maybe you gotta get back.
Well, I don't know if it's telling him to make Aliyah, but I do think it's telling him that not everything is so good. Don't think that you've solved all of your problems. Could be, it could be. A third approach of this, by the way, is a fascinating one, which I did send as well. The copy that I sent out did not come out as well on my scan, but there is this page which comes from an interesting book recently published by Yehuda Landy. Yehuda Landy is he's I guess somewhat of an archaeology buff, I'm going to call him, because I don't believe he's an archaeologist himself, but he's very much up on archaeology. And what Landy talks about in this piece, and this is the sheet that I handed to everyone. He says very simply, if you look, running and controlling this vast empire was, of course, dependent on the ability to collect and raise taxes. The Persians had worked this out to perfection. Herodotus describes the tax system in detail, listing the amount each satrapy was required to bring to the king's treasury per annum. There are I always pronounce his name wrong. Persepolis' relief showing some of the various nations presenting their annual tax to the king. This is the palace there. Okay, there were two palaces in Persia. The big palace that we have the most of is Persepolis's palace. And if you look on the side, you see these pictures. They move up the side of the wall and actually continue a little further where there are steps. And there are different nations that are portrayed. So if you look, you see the Egyptians in the middle picture who are coming with their tributes, Ionians with their tributes, the Babylonians with their tributes, and each of them are dressed differently, if you notice. Okay, and so all of this, one might ask why the Megillah stresses here that Achashverosh put a tax on the land when surely taxes were nothing new. The Targum Sheni learns from this verse that he exempted the Jewish people from taxes in honor of Esther while laying taxes upon the other countries. In other words, the way this section ends, okay, one is Grossman says, don't feel so good. Okay, it ain't over. According to Dalby says, wait a second, it is an expression of Mordechai's strength. And here, Landy is bringing that from Targum Sheni. This is actually talking about Achashverosh's goodness to the Jewish people through Esther, where he removes the taxes. When Esther first became the queen, the king honored her by lowering taxes everywhere. And then the king would have just exempted Esther's nation from taxes entirely, but he didn't know her nationality at the time. He therefore lowered the taxes on all the nations. Now, upon discovering Esther's origin, Achashverosh exempted her nation from taxes and restored the original tax upon all the other nations. So if you go back to Perek Bet, to chapter 2, verse 18, okay, if you go back there and you'll see that chapter 2, verse 18, it says, Vayasam keter malchut berosha, he crowns Esther, Vayamlicha tachat Vashi is the 17, he makes her the queen, Vayasam melech mishteh gadol lechol sarav avadav, he makes a great feast for all of his officers and his servants at Mishteh Esther, a feast in honor of Esther, V'hanachal imdinot asa, and he gave a discount to all of the kingdoms. In other words, Hanachas lemdinot asa, he lowered taxes in honor of her coronation. Now, according to the Targum Sheni, what that means is he lowered taxes initially in her honor. He would have lowered the taxes of her nation, but he didn't know who her nation was. So he just made a blanket lowering, he figured out a good percentage, whatever it was. And now, why is Achashverosh putting on a tax on all the rest of the people? Because of the fact that he now knows who Esther is. And so he's removed the tax from the Jewish people, but he's got to equalize his income. And so he ups the taxes on the others. That's the Targum Sheni. Yeah.
But where is it written that you remove the tax from the Jew?
That's Targum Sheni. It's in the Targum Sheni. Targum Sheni, if you remember, there's more than one version of the Targum on Megillat Esther, and the Targum Sheni is a famous one that is available. In fact, we had a connection here, Professor Grossfeld from originally Milwaukee, and then he lived his last years here in Chicago. Bernard Grossfeld actually did the Targum Sheni to Megillat Esther, the scientific edition of it as well. And so if you look in the Targum Sheni, you see that. So now we have three theories of why we end with the taxation. Theory number one was it shows how powerful Achashverosh is. Okay, that really works. But when you talk about why would we want to end on how powerful Achashverosh is really, it's an ominous message. It's not a message of absolute celebration. And in fact, if you look in each one of these steps, he made Mordechai great. He did this, right? It's how powerful he is. So we want to end with that. Possibility number 2, okay, was the possibility as well of Darby. That Darby says that it is, again, the fact that Achashverosh through Mordechai came to understand that there's greater benefit to having a kingdom that works than trying to rob one group within a kingdom. We could have some wonderful drashot about what's happening in the world today. The third possibility, okay, which is the Targum Sheni, is this was a step because he had now forgiven taxation for the Jews and he had to equalize things. So this was the next step, which is the continuation in a sense of a story. Is it the continuation of the story? Is it a message that's coming to us or not? We really don't know. And the reality is these are all theories. But there is no question that this issue of taxation coming here is a bit strange. It's not the way you normally don't come up at the end of a celebratory novel and say, let me tell you how to really celebrate. We're going to tax everybody. There aren't too many people who normally smile with that. Now, what the tax is specifically, we don't know. Now, we do know there have been taxes. So interestingly, the Chachmei Tzarfat, they suggested, the French scholars, times of the Tosafot, they suggested that the tax was a new kind of tax, that this was actually what's called a mas oved. It's a labor tax. A labor tax we remember back from Paro. The reason why the Jews were able to be enslaved in the time of Paro is that he placed a tax on the Jews. You don't pay taxes with money, but you have to you pay taxes with a certain amount of product. You have to work for the king. However you want to get it done, you get it done. And so there was this kind of mas oved, which really fits very nicely into the idea of talking about Achashverosh having power. He's able to do that. However, what ended up happening, that according to Dat Mikra disagrees. He says this is additional taxation. Now, by the way, what kind of tax he puts in can fit into those 3 different theories. If it's a labor tax, well, that buttresses Grossman's argument that this was a show of power. If it was just additional taxation, regular kind of taxation, that can fit very well with the Targum Sheni, who says simply that he had to equalize taxes because he lost the income from the Jewish people. We don't know for sure. The Ibn Ezra says that actually what he's doing is, it's important to notice that this mas ala aretz v'yehayam, according to Ibn Ezra, he's taxing the countries who are further out and may have been avoiding taxes or may not have been taxes. He is extending his power, but he's showing that it's a consolidation of this massive empire that he ruled over. All of those are possibilities. The Ibn Ezra says that it's to the credit of Mordechai that he was able to consolidate the power. If you even remember in Perek Chet, when Mordechai sends out messengers with the second Igeret, with the second letter, Mordechai makes sure that he's sending it. He's sending it to the 127 provinces from Ethiopia to India. And in so doing, we see that Mordechai had this sense of the magnitude of the kingdom. He was the one, perhaps, and this is, I'm going a step further with Ibn Ezra than I think the Ibn Ezra is doing, but that was the nature of Mordechai. He knew how to do this. He was this great advisor, and that again fits in very well with Dalby's position, that this was Mordechai who was acting in his role as an advisor and helping the king. There was a question, yeah.
Real quick question. Is this place still in existence?
Yeah, that's the archaeological dig.
Yeah, I mean, if you go to Iran or Iraq, whatever it is.
If you go to Iran, yeah, you can see that.
this.
You can see it's a famous archaeological site and people visit there.
I'm not going.
Yeah, not suggesting you go, but you can. Yeah, Joel.
Do you know if anybody talked about why Achashverosh is written without the Vav?
It's written in a number of different ways. If you notice, the Vav is the Cree. We're supposed to read it with a Vav, but most likely, if you remember, his real name, it would be the closest way of spelling it would be the Chet Shin Vav Re Shin, Chir Yasha. Okay, and I'm only pronouncing it as Rabbi Mishkin taught us to pronounce it, and I don't know how the Persians pronounce it, so I apologize if anyone knows Farsi and knows how they pronounce it right. We say it in English as Xerxes. In Hebrew, we actually have this this approach of adding an aleph sound before. And so as a result, it becomes Achashverosh. And why sometimes written with a vav, sometimes with an aleph, those spellings are really transliterations and somewhat of a change into the Hebrew spellings itself. So the spelling you see here is probably the closest spelling to Xerxes that you would find.
Paragraph is spelled with the vav.
100%. And it wasn't something, it wasn't something that went back and forth for great drishot. Now we're all the way up to Pasuk Bet, and we're doing okay. We're going to finish the parak. V'chol ma'aseh tokfo ugvurato ufarashat gedulat Mordechai. And all of the story, all of the issues of his power and his valor and the whole and his raising of Mordechai, Asher Gidlo HaMelech, who was done by the king. Remember, we're showing the king's power here. They're written in the annals. Now, the Chachmei Tzarfat says, if you look at it, what's written in the annals of the kings of Persia? What does the pasuk say?
Three things. Masay Tokfo,
His power,
Gvurato,
right? His valor,
Parashat Gedulat Mordechai.
and Mordechai going up, right? Raising up. What isn't contained in there? Huh? Esther's really not, doesn't sound like Esther necessarily is the same character that we portray. In other words, what's interesting in this is the Chachmei Tzarfat says there's two chronicles that we're dealing with. Are the royal chronicles. The royal chronicles make as the central character the king. It makes all the sense. His power, his value, how he raised Mordechai. That's the version that you had in the official histories of Persia. Different than what we have. Now, those versions, in fact, the Chachmei Tzarfat referred to them with this wonderful phrase, divrei tiulim. That, they're just, a tiul is a travel, a travelogue. Okay, meaning not that it's real important stuff. We look at it almost as if stuff which isn't for us, things you can regale in, but really aren't the key of the story. That's what's written there, not what's written in our Megillah. We have the other record of it. Our record is a record where we see the need to be mefarsem the nes. Remember, the whole idea of Purim is Persumei Nisa. We have Persumei Nisa on Chanukah. Everyone knows about the menorah, but Persumei Nisa that we have is reading the Megillah as part of the Persumei Nisa of Purim. We have to publicize the miracle. That's, by the way, and this is just a pet peeve, and I apologize on this moment of op-ed. That's one of the problems that we have with all of these small minyanim that people try to create. There's a lot of house minyanim for Mikra Megillah, where people say, we'll get 5 people together, 10 people. It should be really 10 people. You need a minyan. You have 10 people together. We'll do Pirsum Anis because with 10 people, it's already considered public, and we'll get this Megillah stuff over quickly. No, it's supposed to be a big deal. Okay, there's a concept of making a big deal out of Purim. All of that, though, is missing entirely from the royal chronicles that they had. Now, Halo Hem Ktuvim, though, they are written, says Ramosha Chalav, that ultimately what that means is both, according to the Tokfo Shel Achashverosh v'Godlo Shel Mordechai, both aspects are contained in those royal chronicles. It's not just Achashverosh. He already starts saying that those royal chronicles also included a piece of Mordechai as well. There was a question. Okay. Ultimately, Ki Mordechai HaYehudi, Mishneh Melech Achashverosh. Now, Ki Mordechai, ultimately, what is that referring back to? That's the Parashat Gedulat Mordechai of the previous pasuk. The story of the greatness of Mordechai. What was the greatness of Mordechai? We're summarizing it here. Mordechai Yehudi, Mishneh Melech Achashverosh. He was this, number 2 for Achashverosh. And when we see that, how you read that phrase, do you say Mordechai? Wow. You might remember when Joe Lieberman was running for vice president, right? We were really, really excited that there might be an Orthodox Jew as vice president. Historically, vice presidents have been a dead-end job. Okay, and vice presidents have been ignored, and people don't know what to do with the vice president, even when the vice president is very capable. You can go back to Johnson and Kennedy when Johnson was Kennedy's vice president. Okay, Johnson was brought on board because he needed votes in the South, and they brought on Johnson, and Johnson was ignored. He didn't really care for Kennedy, and Kennedy didn't really care for Johnson. Two different styles. And you can go on now. Recently, we have a current vice president, and my guess is if you ask people Kamala Harris's name, they will pause for a moment, trying to remember, okay, who's the vice president right now? And really, she's been I think she's doing ribbon cuttings I don't know where she is now. She's in Europe doing things, but the role of a vice president can be relatively insignificant, or there are times where it can be significant, very, very significant. Cheney and Bush, if you think about the powers and things that happen like that. Mishneh Lamelech Achashverosh, the number 2 to the king of Achashverosh. We generally would look at this as, wow, he's viceroy. Or we could look at it as he's not the boss. He's still the number 2. And there are 2 different ways of looking at this. Grossman, in that piece I gave you, by the way, has this piece where he talks about that some of the terms, the only other time we talk about Gedulah, someone being raised up, was Haman in the Megillah, that it may not be by accident that some of the same words are found here and there. Not that Chas v'Shalom, Haman and Mordechai could be compared, but the actions of Achashverosh regarding his number 2 could perhaps be compared. And so here, Grossman suggests this is not praising Mordechai, it's actually giving you more information about Achashverosh. Achashverosh is great. Achashverosh is valiant. Achashverosh is powerful. Achashverosh raised up Mordechai. He gets all the credit for Mordechai. And that's one way of looking at it. And in fact, that plays right into the second part of that pasuk, because the second part of that pasuk says, he was v'gadol v'ratzui l'rov echav, and he was. He found favor. Ratsui. How do they translate it in English? Wanted. They say popular.
No, found favor.
Found favor. Okay, with the Jews. But what does he say? L'rov echad. Well, he says what? With multitudes of Jews. Multitude of his brothers. Is that what it says?
Yeah,
Brethren.
brethren.
Interesting. So he's not following Rashi. Actually, he's kind of paraphrasing Rashi a little bit. Rashi says, "V'lo l'chol echav." Mordechai didn't find favor. There was still, it's like the old joke about, the rabbi gets sick and there's a board meeting and the president of the board goes back to the rabbi and says, "Rabbi, I want you to know, we had a vote and by majority we're wishing you were refuah shlema." Okay, now the reality is, Mordechai has just saved the Jewish people together with Esther. And Rashi says, look at this word, l'rov echav. He couldn't get unanimity. There were only the majority of people liked him. That there were still people, okay? Because if you notice, and Rashi says based on a medrash, is he wasn't spending his time in the best of ways. He's now in the royal court, and he isn't any longer serving in his Jewish role as one of the great leaders of the Jewish people. Okay, and ultimately, what can you do? Other than that, in fact, the Rikrai says, whoa, they're still not happy with him for another reason. There's a group of people who keep on going and say, this is really great what happened. But Mordechai, you remember, you didn't bow down to Haman. The problems all started with your actions. You did this to us. Now, true, you got us out of the mess, but we may not have been in this mess had it not been for you. Okay. Now, yeah. We'll get to that. Hopefully we'll get to that. Yeah.
Isn't there new information in this pasuk where it says, "Ki Mordechai ha'Yehudi Mishneh lamelech ha'Achashverosh"? Did we see it out of Mishneh lamelech?
Yeah, we've had the Mishneh lamelech. We ultimately did it.
Haman had a tabat hamelech.
right?
He
But
goes to Mordechai. We talked about it.
so we're gonna look, where does he have the term of Mishnah? So if you, well, one moment. If you look back in Perek Chet, it has, when we talk about Tetvav, Tetvav, he doesn't use the word Mishnah. Mordechai Yatzah Milifnei HaMelech B'levush Malchut.
Position.
Yes, so I would, and
It's
I'm,
a piece of new information. He's actually, it's like a promotion.
it's a formalization. How about it?
Formalization.
A formalization, I think would be fair. He's given him the very same signet ring to be able to do what they wanted to do. That was the position of Haman, who was a Mishneh Lamelech also in the same
But we
sense.
don't,
We-
we
but you're
can't
right.
say that because that's not officially stated in the Megillah.
Fair, it is not stated in that same way. It's interesting. It is a new position, and it's still the position, by the way, the Ibn Ezra wants to defend Mordechai a little bit. He says, no matter how good you are, nobody ever gets unanimity along the way, and it's all possible. Now, interestingly, the Manot Levi, that's Rav Alkovitz, who also authored the L'chadodi, in his parish, he says, and this is the same as the Rashba, he says, Rov means all. That when Rov can have two meanings. Okay, Rov can be majority, or Rov can be all. And where you find it, if you look, and I gave you this handout. The handout was from actually the Reddelheim Siddur, which was called the Safa Berura. And if you look in that Siddur, and I will bring it up for the people who are online, okay, and hopefully you looked at this as well. It is one of the various versions of the Siddurim for the Yekes, okay. And here on this, if you look, when we look in Nishmat, okay, we have the term Berov Hatishpachot, that we praise God. If you notice right here on the second side, Elokah kol briot adon kol toladot hamulal Berov Hatishpachot. Okay, God over all creation, the master over all that is born, okay, who's praised Berov Hatishpachot with the, if we say majority of Tishpachot, and at the bottom, what he ends up doing, Rav Wolf Heidenheim, who was the editor of the Rittelheim Siddur, he says, Berov HaTishpachot, it's in the red box at the bottom, Ta'amo, Beribui HaTishpachot, with the multitude of praises, Klomar Bechol HaTishpachot, meaning all praises, Va'af Shem Rabim, even though there are so many of them. V'zeh Shimush Milat Rov B'Lashon Ivri. And that's what Rov means in Hebrew. Lo wrote al ribui haklal, to talk about multitudes. V'zetam v'rov atzmotai v'chid, and that's an Eov where it says rov atzmotai, not the majority of my bones, but the many bones. Kavod oshro v'rov banav. Okay, we talk about his wealth and many of his sons. Ribui banav omnam chazal hagilu l'shtamesh bo binyan acher. However, Chazal used the word rov in a different fashion, B'omram rubo kekulo, where they said the majority is like everything. Futzrachti la'ir kan al inyan hazeh. Okay, and I have to make a comment on this, says Rav Wolf Heidenheim, because laniach dat hamit kashim b'zeh, to be able to resolve the problems that a lot of people have over this issue. So it's an interesting piece.
So he's disputing that it's the majority.
He's
saying
disputing.
everybody.
He's right. He's saying it's everybody, which is Rav Alkovitz as well in the Rashba. Rov means the multitude, which is interesting that in the translation of Art Scroll, who in Chumash they always follow Rashi, that they doesn't seem that if Art Scroll says the multitudes, they're not following Rashi. They're actually following the Manot Levi, and they're following the Rashba and Wolf Heidenheim here. Now, what did he do? Doresh Tov La'amo. Okay, he's seeking the goodness for his people. What is Doresh Tov La'amo? The key factor here is the verb. What is Doresh?
See.
To seek. I can do good, or I can seek to do good. What's the difference between the two? Doing good can be reactive. Seeking to do good is proactive. And so the Ibn Ezra says that what this compliment about Mordechai is, he sought out ways to do good. He was proactive. Okay, and not only was he proactive, he was doing this, say, the Chochmei Tzarfat, with the full knowledge of the king and all of his ministers. They knew he was the Jewish guy there. In fact, that's why, if you notice, Mordechai HaYehudi, we're careful to mention that this number 2 is, all too often, unfortunately, when a Jewish person comes into a position of power, especially political power, they have to bend over backwards to show that they're not favoring the Jewish people. Okay, it was Rahm Emanuel, okay, who did, publicly, you would not find him with a kippah on. Okay, and he avoided early on. Later on, he came around later on in his mayoralty, but early on in his mayoralty, I remember we had a meeting before the election, and he met with the Orthodox rabbis in our community, and he said he is running, but he doesn't want to be known as the Jewish mayor. He wants to be known as the mayor of the city of Chicago. And he worked very hard at that initially. Here, Mordechai up front, Mordechai HaYehudi, he's Doresh Tov La'amo. And when there's conversations in the palace, he's the voice looking out for the Jewish people. Yeah, Jim.
The other one is a little different. I think it's an anti-Semitic. He's Mordechai the Jew.
Okay, so it depends. Again, it could depend on how you view this last parak. If this last parak is the ominous one, like Grossman talks about, if it's the ominous one saying, after all these wonderful things, now Jews don't, be wary. It ain't over. And you're right, then he's Mordechai HaYehudi, he's the Jew. If you look at it like many of the other Meforshim do, this is Dorish Tov, this is still a continuation of the victory. Yeah.
But how does that play out with the way the Megillah opens, where you have Achashverosh trying to make everybody feel like they're all one people, we don't care about any differences. You had this mix of assimilation and allowing some diversity, and he's promoting
The diversity
of the Jews.
Because if you remember, we had talked about that this is undoing, for that approach, this is undoing Mefuzar Meforad Ben Amim, that the Jews were isolationist. The Jews were segregationists. They were different than everybody else. They were separating. Here, he's sitting here and he's doing what's for the Jewish people, but he's part of the government and he's undoing that idea. And looking out for his own people is not the pejorative. It does not necessarily have to be pejorative. The way we present it sure sounds like simple reading Doresh Tov sounds good that he's doing. And remember, when we also look about it, when you look at the themes of this Megillah that goes through, you have the themes of the Mishtev, the feasts that are taking place, right? And those feasts continue all the way until the end, where you have the Feast of Esther as well, where we talk about how things were done for Esther, where you have Esther's two feasts that she's offering, and here the celebrations. We started with Achashverosh, and Achashverosh, again, we don't know what he is. We don't know if he's a Melech Pikech, or Melech Tipesh. The Gemara goes back and forth. Is this person wise, cunning, and sly? Or is he foolish? Is he a buffoon who is led by others? You could read it both ways. Some of the readings we've been doing where it shows how wise he is and how he knows how to duck when he needs to duck could be taking that latter approach, that there's a wisdom there, a political wisdom. Yeah, Margaret.
Do you think there's any significance to that last pasuk being written after it says that everything else is written?
So again, if I say the pasuk Gimel is actually explaining the Gedulat Mordechai, it's not really written afterwards. It's just, this is the explanation of what was. So it's almost like it's parenthetical with a footnote going, like a footnote.
He is a cause or that.
Right. So we don't know. There's a number of different ways of looking at it.
So one of the things about Mefuzel and Meforad is that it describes that Am Yisrael at the time are really, they really are begalut, they really are not unified. And that's one of the things that Matanot Levionim and Mishloach Manot actually addresses that. That was one of the reasons why what Esther did was so brazen, was because she was essentially unifying a peoples that had really gone off and was no longer uniform, and she was unified, and she was actually bringing them together again.
In an unusual way, Ilana, it's a very good point, but in an unusual way, by creating a two-tiered holiday, which no other holiday has. There's no other holiday that has two different dates, depending on where you live. So that might be saying that everyone in different ways could celebrate as well. But I agree with you. I agree with your point very much. Last phrase in this, because we have to hurry up since we're running out of time. And I told you 3 psukim take a long time. V'dover shalom l'chol zaro. And he's seeking peace for all of zaro. Now, zaro can be personal or it can be national. Rashi takes this approach, as does the Vilna Gaon, takes this approach and says, l'chol zaro, to all of the Jewish people. Or as Rashi says, zaro musava alamo, the zaro goes back and it parallels to doresh tov la'amo, v'dover shalom l'chol zaro. Amo and zaro are parallel terms, and therefore it's not his own offspring. He's not working for nepotism. He's working for the sake of his people throughout. And this is interesting because the Gra goes a step further. He says, Im hakol umetiv im kol ha'umot shelo yinakmu b'zar'o achrei moto. He's seeking peace for his people. How does he seek peace? Because he looks after everyone. He's not being Judaic-centric and just taking care of the Jews. He's trying to take care of everyone, knowing full well that if he takes care of everyone, Mordechai HaYehudi, the odds are the others will not come after the Jews again. It's all possible, and we're not done yet. Now, for those who are online, I apologize. I have one more handout that I didn't share with you, only because I couldn't figure out how to scan it last night. I only did it today. There is, yeah, I'm sorry.
Elaine's question of why Esther is needed.
We'll get to it. We'll still get to it. Okay, good. The last piece here is there's a new Haggadah out. It's an interesting Haggadah, and it's the Haggadah with the comments of Rabbi Berkowitz, Eliezer Berkowitz. And what he did was this, and Eliezer Berkowitz, it actually never wrote a commentary on the Haggadah. A fellow out of Teaneck, his name is Ruvain Mol. I think I know his wife. I know his rabbi, who he thanks in the introduction of Shalom Baum. And he put it together. He had done another one of a similar thing of this. He writes in his introduction and I'm sorry, I don't remember now. He had done another one for another event as well, and I forgot what it is, and I don't remember, but this one, he just came out recently. And he takes a piece on the concept of Dover Shalom from Faith After the Holocaust. It's a pretty heavy piece, these couple of paragraphs, but I just want to read, I'm going to read it and hopefully try to explain it. And it's pretty impressive, imagining that, remember, English was Dr. Berkowitz's probably 4th or 5th language. The universal significance of both the Jewish survival and the return of the Jewish people to their ancestral home should be understood in the context of the new era which mankind has reached. In other words, getting back Eretz Yisrael as Medinat Yisrael, you have to put it in the context of where we are as a world. Jews have survived as a homeless people through the long centuries without political might and significant material power, while mankind pursued the illusion that human destiny is to be determined by exactly those factors which the Jewish people were lacking. We never had power. We didn't have wealth. The rest of the world sought power and wealth. They have survived, witnessing again and again the nemesis of mere material power into the world era when the Jewish affirmation has become a necessity for universal society. They see what happens with money, with power. Similarly, the return of the Jewish people to its ancient homeland should be seen in a historical context. This hour in which man has ascended to the pinnacle of material power is also the hour of his deepest moral and spiritual exhaustion. Because of the surfeit of power and the exhaustion of the spirit, everything is in jeopardy. Quite clearly, the wave of the future is neither with the power colossi of the moment. If either of them should insist on forcing the future of mankind in its own likeness, the world will be left only with shambles of an inglorious past. In other words, power, it's a beautiful English, okay? Power and wealth, even though they're at the top, if that's what we seek, it's all wrong. The immensity of the possibilities for the works of peace which are inherent in this great power, and which in the present world situation is also wrought with ultimate peril, has already rendered archaic both giants, capitalism, and communism as modes of coping with the challenges that confront man. In other words, works of peace have taken the lead over material wealth and power. The foundations on which they arose have sunk away into the depths of past time. The historic moment calls for a civilization that surpasses both. The universal significance of Israel's return to the land of the fathers we see in the fact that it's taken place after the Holocaust. In this hour of universal spiritual exhaustion and universal need for a spiritual rebirth in itself. The birth of the state of Israel is not a response, but you have to look at it within the context. It's coming up. It has a moment, it has this opportunity. The restoration of Jewish sovereignty in Zion is not a goal in itself. What could be the political significance of a little Jewish state in the world of today? Political sovereignty is only the framework within which this remarkable people of history may lead its life according to its own vision and create a culture whose essential resources can only be of the spirit. That the relevance of that creation for mankind need not be proportionate to the political and material size of Israel has been sufficiently proven by the past history of the Jewish people and of the world. In other words, what Berkowitz is saying, and I'm not doing him justice, I read it though, I think he does himself justice, is that ultimately, there's a lot of things that you can seek in this world. There's the materialism, there's the power, but the one that makes the difference is the spirit. He challenges the state of Israel to be the state of the spirit. But he also talks about this as seeking the peace. The fact that the Megillah ends, Avidover Shalom L'chol Zaro, is not just, if you would take Berkowitz's approach, a statement of he's looking to protect the Jewish people, like the Vilna Gaon says, he's taking care of everyone to protect the Jewish people. What he's seeking is for the Jewish people to now go beyond where they had been. The Jewish people had been, Ilana pointed it out, Yafa pointed it out, assimilated, separate, and in an absolute mess. Everything rose to this crescendo of danger. Now where the Jews have the opportunity, what the Megillah is telling us, that the greatest opportunity we have before us is Dover Shalom L'chol Zaro. And that's the hopeful note on which the Megillah ends. It's not that he's trying to protect us, but rather, just as we had Doresh Tov L'Amo, we said Amo is parallel to Zaro, Doresh is probably parallel to Dover, seeking the peace. It's a proactive movement that Mordechai is putting forward, and Mordechai is putting forward this proactive movement, perhaps to change the tone of the way the world was that he lived in a much greater way. So that's the way it ends. Now, the question is, why isn't Esther mentioned here? And that same question, by the way, if you notice, Esther's role in the previous chapter went back and forth. Esther's role, first, Mordechai was the one who approached the Chachmei Eretz Yisrael. If you remember, Mordechai was the one who told Esther what her position had to be. It's true that Esther is the heroine of the story. Mordechai is the power of the story. And so I would suggest that we're not ignoring Esther, but at this point, Esther actually fades off into history. We don't know more about Esther. Esther had her moment. Mordechai is introduced, when he's first brought in, he's introduced as a person with history, Asher Haglam Yerushalayim, and it's true, we talked about that may not have been him, may have been one of his ancestors, but nevertheless, he's a person of history. He's the one who takes the steps of Big Time Vaterish. He's pulling all the strings. Esther takes the moment, and she lends her name at the end of the previous parak to show that this idea of establishing a holiday, it also has the power of the malchut behind it. It's the queen as well who's making this request. But I believe that when we do Mordechai, we're not consciously or strongly excluding Esther, but that we're returning to that key position within the story of Mordechai being the one. And even then, we still have this competing factor in this chapter of what's Achashverosh's role. So all of these different characters have different moments. This is now Mordechai's. If you think about it, the queen no longer has this role. Mordechai has the role. Mordechai is the one who's going to be advising the king and has advised the king, and his role continues. And I think that's why Esther is not here, even though she plays significant in the previous chapter and in others as well. We're going to stop right here. Yes.
Going on what Dr. Berkowitz said, it's similar to what Naftali Bennett is trying to accomplish right now by shuttling back and forth, even
I'm
going
not-
to Russia on Shabbos.
Yeah, Eddie, I'm not sure. I'm not sure what Naftali, first of all, I'm just not sure. I'll leave it at that. But I will say that next week we will meet again. We're going to start the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. We're going to go back into Babylonia. And then after that, we're going to come back there to Israel. And we're also going to practice our Aramaic a little bit. Okay, so as a result, I think we're going to stop here. Yafi, and one last point.
This concludes, I like Reverend Dr. Berkowitz's piece because it puts him back in the role as like the designer of the plot. He told Esther what to do, how to behave. That was the leadership position that he took in orchestrating.
And now he's orchestrating
And
again.
now he's orchestrating it again. So I think that's really beautiful.
I think it's a beautiful piece. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, have a Freilich and Purim. There's a lot of things